Boy, what a turnout. Good morning. I'd like to, my name is Chuck Ahlem, and currently a founding partner of Hillmar Cheese and currently the chairman of the Dairy Cares here in California. First of all, I'd like to start by thanking our co-hosts, which is California Milk Advisory Board, Dairy Council of California, California Dairy Research Foundation, and California Dairy Quality Assurance Program. I also like to thank those event sponsors that you'll see in your program. But most important, I want to thank our summit sponsors for providing the fund to make this event possible. Finally, I want to thank all you for attending. I mean, we're looking at maybe 200. We're over 600 here today. It just kind of blows us away to see that we have this much interest in this discussion about sustainability. Our dairy families, men and women in the dairy community are really fortunate to have this kind of an event to kind of express to our regulators what we are doing, and in the process of learning a little bit ourselves about sustainability issues. The dairy industry is not only an occupation, it's a way of life for each and every one of us dairy farmers. Our theme you will hear continuously in the next few days will be not just environmental stewardship, but economic success, which cannot be achieved without environmental stability. For this industry, our dairies are under continuous stress these last few years. So with that, our industry, the U.S. has, last 10 years, has lost over 17,000 dairies. California alone in the last 10 years has lost, that's about 30% of the industry, and California has lost 500 dairies in the last 10 years. So which is why we're increasingly it's increasingly critical that regulators and policymakers recognize our environmental improvement. Sustainability has also got to make economic sense if we are able to move forward. So with that, it's kind of interesting how lines parallel my introduction today of our Secretary of Agriculture, but Karen Ross and I have met her over 20 years ago, and she was working on the sustainability program for the wine industry. So she has a lot of experience in this topic and some of the regulatory pressure. So it gives me good pleasure to introduce the industry's friend, my friend, the Secretary of Agriculture, Karen Ross.
Good morning. Thanks for being here. Well, hello. The rest of the crew is back there, Casey. Yeah. I told him to disperse. We have great CDFA staff here. I was going to get to that later. But I'm very happy to see you here. And I'm glad that you mentioned that we met Chuck a number of years ago when we started the Sustainable Wine Growing Program, Wine Institute, and the California Association of Wine Grape Growers. And it was in this very room, our first year of the Unified Wine and Grape Symposium, where I could relate to the sentiment of the organizers this morning, where people are showing up. You know, when you plan an event for a year, and just to have someone attend is a great idea. And I remember being in this room, and the theme for the opening panel was sustainability. And we were hoping we'd get a couple hundred people, and we had 1,000 show up. And this year will be the 20th Unified Wine and Grape Symposium, and every year it gets about 15,000 people. So I wish for you the same kind of success. I wish for you something that I witnessed and participated on a panel with Chuck in Denver just a few weeks ago, that perhaps you can be part of the leading organizations within California agriculture to perhaps turn this into a California Ag Sustainability Summit. Because if there's anything that California Grown stands for, the brand of California, which is so well received and trusted around the world, It is about the families, the long-term generational views that really drive the values of our agricultural business. It is about the environmental ethic. It is the commitment of our farmers and ranchers to farm to the highest standards, to make sure that consumers can reach for our products and know that they're healthy, nutritious, and have strong standards that stand behind them. What the dairy sector has done in the last 5 years in particular, as we really focused on how do we turn regulations around to be more supportive of what we're doing. It started with a simple challenge from my then boss, Secretary Tom Vilsack, before I left Washington, D.C., who said, how can you have the largest number of dairy cows in the country and so few dairy digesters? And I said, well, Mr. Secretary, let me explain California regulatory systems. And what we did is created a federal state dairy digester task force to really pull apart all the regulations that were actually conflicting or redundant. It took 2 years to go through this process to actually put a system in place with a consolidated permit review process as the beginning of working with industry and with environmental groups to really go after climate change investment dollars to support dairy farmers and the rest of agriculture as well, but in particular the dairy sector. It is what the Dutch are calling the connected economy of not thinking about waste as waste, meaning cow poop, but how do we recognize all the values there, all the byproducts that can be generated, and turn those into assets with additional revenue streams. Now, I'm going to give a shout out to a couple of my good friends. One is Chuck Ahlem, who a number of years ago took a leap of faith to partner with a conservation environmental organization headquartered in San Francisco. Ashley Boren is here from Sustainable Conservation, and anybody who's had the opportunity to work with sustainable conservation knows that this is an organization that's committed to the environment and finding solutions that make economic sense. And they picked dairy farmers as their first partners in the Central Valley. I still remember that, Chuck, and you went on that advisory board, and I bet some of your neighbors were looking at you like, why are you doing that? But let's be honest, not only are we in a state that has 40 million residents who drive a lot of the voting patterns in Sacramento and at the ballot box on initiatives, it's a state that has huge pressures from that population for environmental standards and the kinds of regulations that we see. But it's not just what our neighbors are driving through who they vote for and the policies they vote for. It's also taking a look at the entire supply chain in our food sector and understanding the scrutiny driven by an innate desire to learn more about our food, where it's coming from, and who's producing it. The Washington Post earlier this year had a headline story that were 9 ways millennials are changing what we eat. And at the top of their list of what they're looking for is transparency and the opportunity to make a connection with who's producing their food. We hosted a 2-day summit in Sonoma County leading up to the Global Climate Action Summit in September. And we had leading food companies from around the world. And every one of them talked about their sustainability planks, their commitment to report on the progress that they're making, and how they're driving decisions all the way down to the farm. What's missing in that conversation, I believe, is the opportunity for the farmer, the boots on the ground, to be in those boardrooms to say, what are your sustainability goals? How can we help you get there? We need time and we need capital to make that happen. And that's the way we've tried to craft our climate change investment funds here in California. We want to do it with voluntary practices, incentive dollars, cost share programs, and technical assistance to make you successful in what you already value, and that is the long-term sustainability of your farm, your dairy, your cooperative or dairy business. We want to support that. And California, it was mentioned in the video, right now has invested over $700 million in agriculture. We believe in agriculture. We want to help farmers and ranchers be the best they can be efficiently and still hit a profitable bottom line and have environmental standards that are beyond compare. So what have we done so far with those investments? The first program was our Sustainable Water Use Efficiency Program that started in the midst of the drought. It's helped farmers save water, save energy, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We've spent $87 million and have funded 614 programs around the state. This year in Prop 68, was it Prop 68, the bond measure that passed? There was a bond measure that passed in June. I lose them, but I do remember others. Anyway, $20 million in bond money for incentive programs for on-farm water use efficiency. That's a significant investment in our green infrastructure, and hopefully we will continue to put that to good use. We started a Healthy Soils program with $7.5 million from the Climate Change Investment Fund. We have a commitment, $10 million from that same proposition, the Water Parks and Wildlife Bond, and another $5 million in climate change investment dollars. Those funds will be released hopefully by the end of this year. We have funded 63 dairy digester projects, $112 million, and 58 alternative manure management projects at $31.5 million, and we have another $99 million, which will be released by the end of this year. That's our goal, to get these released by the end of this year so that people will have an opportunity to compete for those dollars. We also, yesterday, at this stage in our program, we felt that we could carve out a small amount of that money, $4 million, for demonstration projects. This could be for pushing new technology in the dairy digester realm, or for new or underutilized alternative manure management programs. We want to collaborate with the dairy families of this state to continue to find new technology, as Chuck said, that makes economic sense and still helps us meet our environmental goals. None of this happens without a healthy, profitable, sustainable dairy sector. And I, as well as anyone in this room, knows the rough times we've been through. When I came back in 2010, we were going through a valley that I hoped we'd never go through again, and yet we seem to have achieved that all over again. We are in a new chapter. I'm very aware of that. November 1 was a new chapter for the California dairy industry. We no longer, at the California Department of Food and Agriculture, are running your milk pooling program. We're running only the quota implementation program. I, with you, pray that it brings you the benefits that people voted on when they voted to go into the federal milk marketing order. We know that at the end of the day, dairy is putting a healthy, nutritious product on the table, that it's vital for the health and long-term productivity of every citizen. We want children to enjoy that product. We want all the emerging economies around the world who are seeking good, improved nutrition to enjoy that product in all the forms that you deliver it. And we thank you on behalf of the state of California for your commitment to joining with us to meet our environmental goals that in the end of the day will mean a sustainable economy and a healthy environment for all Californians. And I thank you all for being here today, and I wish you great success, and 20 years from now, that this is a conference that has thousands and thousands of people in attendance. And with that, I'd like to introduce one of my favorite academics, the person who's here to tell you the real truth about clean air in the dairy sector, Dr. Frank Mitloehner from UC Davis. I've known Frank for quite some time. He's done a lot of very progressive work and serves in a number of prestigious positions in addition to all of his work and his research on the campus at UC Davis. He, to me, is what a great academic and cooperative extension person is all about, working directly with farmers and ranchers, the boots on the ground, to understand what are the problems that you're facing and how do we find solutions. And he's not afraid to take on the media and bust some myths every now and then, which led to him playing a leading role with the UN and the FAO on setting the record straight on methane emissions and dairies. He continues to use his good research and real data, not fake data, real data, to tell the story about what is happening or what is not happening on our dairies and in the livestock sector. He is a great friend of the industry. He's someone that I look forward to working with for many more years to come. Frank, welcome to the podium. Thanks for being here to help open this great conference. And thank you all. Have a great year.
Thank you very much, Madam Secretary, and good morning, everybody. It's such a pleasure and honor to be here, and I'm really delighted to see so many familiar faces. I have been asked to talk to you about climate-smart dairy, global and state perspectives. And I've been in these trenches now since 2002, and I have seen quite some challenges, and I want to share some of those with you. First of all, follow me on Twitter. If you're not on Twitter, you should be on Twitter. I thought it was the most ridiculous thing about 4 months ago, and now I'm a big fan. That's because you can reach 1 million people in a week. I mean, how else do you reach 1 million people in a week? Anyhow, so that was my pitch there. This is one of my favorite photos here. It shows California from space. It shows the topography we have around the Great Central Valley. The Sierra Nevada on the one side, the coastal mountain range on the other side. We are not a agricultural powerhouse, we are the agricultural powerhouse in the United States. California produces twice as much in agricultural revenue as the #2 agricultural state. We are producing 50% of fruits and vegetables, 90% of nuts. Everybody knows we are nuts, but we are producing a lot of nuts too. We are producing 20% of US dairy. So this is a huge economy. Everybody thinks of Hollywood and Silicon Valley, but agriculture people normally don't think of when they think of California, but they should. We are the backbone of the state. We also have challenges, and you can see here the topography poses one of these challenges because you have these two mountain ranges, and right in between you have the Great Central Valley, the nation's #1 agricultural production area. And the topography really means that any kind of air pollution that's produced either in the valley or that's transported in from the outside, let's say from the ocean, from international traffic, as well as from international sources such as Asia or so, they travel across the Pacific and they reach California's Central Valley a couple days later. And we are battling these emissions not just since recent history, but for a long time. The first explorers, Western explorers of California, reported in 1840 that the Central Valley of California should not really be inhabited because of the poor air quality. Because at that time, the native Indians burned a lot of stuff here, and that already generated poor air quality. So what you see here, this milky stuff in the middle, in the Central Valley, that's not fog, that's smog. So we clearly have an air quality challenge to reckon with. In fact, we have the worst air quality in the United States, right around the San Joaquin Valley. #2 is Los Angeles, #3 is Houston, Texas. This is one of my favorite photos too. It shows the fence line on the left side of the fence, a dairy with 1,000 happy California cows on the right side, recent urban encroachment down in Chino with 2,000 unhappy California residents. Why did these people move there? Why? Because the land was relatively cheap. That's why they moved there. What was one of the first things they did after they moved there? No, not complain. Complaining is for losers. They sue. That's what you do in California. Now, if you have a scenario like that in front of your planning commission, make sure that you oppose it, because whatever you do on a dairy, you will not appease neighbors that are that close to your operation. People will be opposed to your odors and flies and dust, no matter how well you run an operation. I will not spend the majority of my talk, or any more of my talk, on the topic of air quality or nuisances, and instead really talk more about greenhouse gases. But these are issues that are big and looming. And this ag-urban interface is intensifying in California because more and more people who decide to move in the state can no longer move into the southern part of the state because that part is already filled to the hilt, but now they are moving into the Central Valley. And this is a scenario that I foresee happening also up and down the San Joaquin Valley in the future. Now, for many of you in the room, the topic of climate change is one that you don't believe in, and I'm familiar with that. Many agriculture producers don't really think this is happening. But I have news for you. I think it is happening, and I also think that human activity has an important part to play in how our climate is affected. What you see on this slide here is the North Pole, the yellow area, the ice extent 10 years ago, the white area, the ice extent now. We see changes all around the world of changing climates, whether it's in Siberia, whether it's in the North Pole, whether it's intensifying storms, droughts, and so forth. And a recent report by our leading agencies in the United States came to the conclusion that this is one of the major strategic challenges of our nation and of nations throughout the world. So just a very short one-on-one on what greenhouse gases are, things like methane, nitrous oxide, CO2, and what the greenhouse effect is. You see here the sun radiating down solar beams to the surface of the earth, and normally those solar beams would be reflected off back into space if there weren't these greenhouse gases. Things like CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, gases that trap the heat from the sun and that trap it for a prolonged period of time. The more of these gas molecules you have in the atmosphere, and the more they're hit by solar beams, the more they trap the heat. It's really simplified, but that's generally what it is. And here are three of the main greenhouse gases. CO2, that's coming out of the bagpipes of vehicles. We are exhaling it, cows are exhaling it. CO2 is the #1 greenhouse gas in the world by total amount. Then methane, and nitrous oxide. Here are the depictions of these three greenhouse gases. Methane is about almost 30 times more heat trapping than CO2, and nitrous oxide is 300 times more heat trapping, meaning 300 times more potent than CO2 and 30 times more potent than CO2. So the whole discussion that I have been battling for the last years is one on methane, how important methane is and how much it's driving the climate. And how much is contributed by livestock. Many of your special friends out there use the methane discussion to get you out of business, quite frankly. Those people who produce alternatives to milk, meat, and so on, use the climate discussion and the impact livestock production has on the climate as a main instrument to discourage the use of your products. And that's one of the reasons why you need to pay attention to that, because you need to be able to distinguish fact from fiction. This slide, I think, is a very important one. It shows in the bottom panel here the years 1750 to 2000. The blue line shows when throughout these 250 years, fossil fuel was extracted, fossil fuel being oil, coal, and gas, pure carbon, that was stored in the ground for hundreds of millions of years, a long time. And as you can see, over a very short period of time, 50, 60, 70 years, we extracted about half of these fossil fuels, of that carbon that was in the ground for so long. And what did we do with that carbon? What did we do with these fossil fuels? We burned them. So where's that carbon now? It's in the atmosphere. And every time the sun hits it, these things heat up. That's the reason why all these climate change conferences, all those COP conferences, are focusing mainly on fossil fuel reductions. Because this is a pollutant, CO2, that's adding up. This is new carbon we add to the atmosphere. Every time you drive a vehicle, you add new carbon to the atmosphere. Because that CO2 has a lifespan of 1,000 years. once you emit it, that molecule will be in the air for 1,000 years. Methane is very different. Methane is a so-called short-lived climate pollutant, meaning it's in the atmosphere, but not for very long, only for 12 years. And then it gets converted for 12 years. That means if you have a dairy and you had that dairy at 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, and you have not changed cow numbers, then the emissions that you released 10, 12 years ago are now gone. You have replaced them with new emissions, but overall you will have stable methane emissions. And that's because methane is a short-lived climate pollutant, and you have to remember that. CO2 is not short-lived. CO2 accumulates, whereas methane kind of plateaus unless you change herd sizes. So here are some facts and fictions that you find in the media, up and down, no matter what you read, whether you read the New York Times or Washington Post or Sacramento Bee or Sunset Magazine or Martha Stewart. I don't care what you read, but this is what you will find. Livestock, they say, produces 18% of all human-caused greenhouse gases. Livestock produces more greenhouse gases than the entire global transportation system. And now really think about that. What this bullet point means is that cows and pigs and sheep and chicken produce more greenhouse gases leading to climate change than all cars, trucks, trains, planes, ships in the world combined. You believe that? All right, but you're biased, right? But that's what that bullet point means, okay? And you find that up and down the media. Then you see reports saying that 70% of all agricultural land is occupied by livestock production. What a waste of space, they say. We should, instead of having livestock, replace livestock with plants and all become vegetarians or vegans. And if you think that's a small minority saying that, you just wait for the next couple of months, and you will see some major reports coming out to that effect. And you will also see that your special friends who want you out of business, those that produce alternatives to your products, use these topics to get you there. And last but not least, there are people who say, if you must consume animal protein, please only from dairies and beef operations and so on that are grass-based. If it's a conventional dairy or beef operation or what have you, then you are ruining the environment. So only pasture-based systems, please. I will talk you through some of these bullet points because I think they are important for you to know. The first two bullet points, the one on livestock producing 18% and livestock producing more greenhouse gases than transportation, stems from this report. Secretary Ross alluded to the United Nations FAO, who I have a mixed history with, to say the least. They produced a report back in 2006, so a long time ago, called Livestock's Long Shadow. And this report, up until this day, profoundly affects the public discourse around livestock. What it said in its executive summary was that the livestock sector is a major player responsible for 18% of greenhouse gases. And it went on saying that livestock produces more greenhouse gases than the entire transportation system. So it was no one less than the world-leading body for food and agriculture that claimed that livestock produces more greenhouse gases than the entire transportation sector. And when the FAO says something like that, it has weight. Now, I already asked you, none of you believes in this, neither did I, and so a couple of my graduate students and I took it upon ourselves to write a report, to write a peer-reviewed publication, and we published it, refuting these claims. And what we found was that the main mistake the FAO made was that they used different methodologies when they compared the livestock sector to the transportation sector. When they looked at the livestock sector, they used a so-called life cycle assessment. Imagine if somebody were to ask you, what's the environmental footprint of a gallon of milk you produce? Then you're not just interested in how much emissions stem from manure or from the belching cow, but you're also interested in all the rest of the life cycle, how much emissions stem from the soil to which you apply herbicides and so on, how much stems from the crops that you grow, the feed that you feed your animals. The animals themselves produce enteric emissions, they belch. They produce manure, but that's not the end of it, because the milk then, after it's in the tank, needs to be transported to a creamery, needs to be processed into something else, needs to go to a supermarket, it's still being cooled. Eventually, somebody will put it in his or her mouth. And at that point, you have the grave. From cradle to grave is what life cycle assessments depict. From cradle to grave, from soil until the point that you put that product in your mouth, whether it's meat or milk or eggs or whatever. Okay? So if you assess the entire footprint of a product or service, then you use a life cycle assessment. The FAO did it, and they did it well for livestock. But they didn't do it for transportation. For transportation, they only looked at tailpipe emissions of cars, trucks, trains, planes, ships, not the production of these vehicles. All the steel, the rubber, the plastic, the tar needed for the roads, the concrete that goes into airports and harbors, and so on. This entire part of the life cycle of transportation they left out and only looked at tailpipe emissions of these vehicles. A classical apples to oranges comparison I think everybody will agree upon. So not just did I find that and published it, but presented it in San Francisco at the American Chemical Society, and among the hundreds of scientists was also one reporter of the Associated Press who listened to my talk and who then interviewed me, and after he interviewed me, he called the FAO in Rome, the authors of Livestocks Long Shadow, and asked them for an interview. He got his interview, and then he wrote an Associated Press release and put it on the AP wire. And 10 minutes later, my life turned into living hell. Because everybody who up until that point had been reporting on the impacts livestock has on the environment now wanted to know why Mitloehner, this guy from UC Davis, disagrees. So the first to report on this whole thing was the BBC in London. So after they received the AP report, they wrote this story here, and they quoted one of the authors of Livestocks Long Shadow, one of the main authors, as saying, and I quote, "I must say honestly that he, Mitloehner, has a point. We factored in everything for meat emissions, and we didn't do the same thing for transportation." Think about that for a second. I have a lot of respect for those people, because we all make mistakes. But if you make a mistake and you own up to it and you say, we made a mistake, it's an honest mistake, we go back to the drawing board, then I have a lot of credit. I give these people a lot of credit for that. The problem is that all the people who loved Livestocks Long Shadow got desperate because all of a sudden their main argument got lost. I tell you, it's very difficult to unring a bell. But that's exactly what has to happen. We have to unring a bell. The authors of Livestocks Long Shadow retracted some of those key findings, but the critics of animal agriculture don't want to let go of that. This industry has been too quiet for too long. And I mean all of you, and me, all of us, too quiet for too long. And we have allowed some critics out there to amass and strategize and get funding in ways that I've never seen before. There's an alliance of organizations out there that is clearly hitting on animal agriculture in ways I've never seen before, using arguments that are not science-based. I hope I will convince you of that. Now, a few years later, that same organization, the FAO in Rome, assembled a global committee consisting of 300 scientists called LEAP, LEAP. And this committee was set out to produce one global gold standard methodology to quantify the impacts of livestock on the environment, livestock and poultry. And they made me the chairman of that report, of that committee. So that was quite a journey to be one of their greatest critics to becoming a chairman of a follow-up organization within the same organization, though. So a partnership formed under the FAO's auspices, and we have completed guidance and guidelines for beef, dairy, poultry, for sheep, small ruminants, for the feed sector, for biodiversity, for water use, all of that publicly available, all of it really now a global gold standard. So I think we've come a long, long way. Now, what does the EPA say with respect to emissions from different sectors? The EPA says that when it comes to greenhouse gases, first of all, CO2 is the most important, most abundant greenhouse gas. With respect to sectors contributing to greenhouse gases, power production and use makes up about 30% of greenhouse gases. Those numbers change year by year, but they're about the same, I mean, roughly. Transportation makes up about a quarter of all greenhouse gases in the United States, and the entire agricultural sector makes up about 9%. But even though this is a cow used here, this is not animal agriculture that's producing 9%. This is all of agriculture. According to the EPA, animal agriculture produces a little less than 4%. If you want to remember one number today, remember 4%. That's the total contribution of animal agriculture with respect to greenhouse gases. And transportation around 26%. So if people now take global numbers, like the FAO 18% number, and a global comparison of livestock to transportation, and apply it to the United States, apply it to California, then you should say, no, that is a faulty approach. You're using retracted global values to depict the US and the California in particular industry, and that is flawed. Use EPA numbers if you want to, and I encourage you to. I believe those numbers to be true. I believe that the EPA is right that livestock production in the United States produces about 4% of all greenhouse gases. In California, the dairy sector produces about 5% of all California greenhouse gases. As a comparison, the transportation sector in California is about 10 times that much, about 50%. But those people who promote milk alternatives, they will use the global number from 2006 to tell people not to drink the real milk, but the alternatives. Soy drink, almond drink. I don't call them milks because almonds don't lactate. But they try to disparage people by using global numbers. So 4% is about that number in the United States. If you think of the entire food supply chain, everything that makes up food, from cradle to grave, then the next slide shows you what our biggest Achilles heel is in the United States and globally. This slide here shows an average US family in front of the food waste that's associated with the production of that food. About 40% of all food produced in the United States, 40% of the food produced in the United States goes to waste. And what I find shocking is that number holds true globally. Even in developing countries, the total amount of food waste is 40%. If you think of the entire food supply chain, that is the biggest liability we have. Now, I teach a class at UC Davis with almost 300 undergraduate students. When I talk about this topic, it puts them in the front of their seats. It's called the 2050 Challenge. What it shows on the x-axis is the year 1750 to 2050, hence the name 2050 Challenge. And what it shows on the z-axis here is the total number of people in the world. I'm in my late 40s. When I was a little boy, we had 3 billion people. We were here. Today, we have 7.6 billion people. We are here. And when I'm an old man, we will have 9.5 billion people. In other words, throughout our lifetimes, throughout my lifetime, human population on this planet will have tripled. We will have 3 times more people on this planet in our lifetimes. But we will not have 3 times more natural resources to feed these people. We will not have 3 times more water, land, fertilizer, and so on. But if we are lucky, we might have the same amount by the time we are old compared to the time we were young. And what that leads to is that we have to make decisions as to how to feed these people. Don't just take it for granted that we can feed whoever we want to feed. We today already have about 800 million people in the world going to bed hungry. This slide is also interesting because it has 2 colors. And the one color here, this orange, is human population in developed countries, so the US and Europe. As you can see, developed countries are plateauing. But in the developing world, human population is skyrocketing. And that's not so much because everybody is now having 10 babies, but it's mainly because of increasing life expectancies. People get older. 20 years ago, the average age in China was in the 60s. Today, it's in the 80s. The same is true all over the world. People get older, and cumulatively, that means more mouths to fill, to feed. This is one of my favorite slides too. As you can see, I show you quite a few of those. The satellite image of the world, and this circle over Southeast Asia contains more people than the rest of the world combined. More people live inside the circle than outside the circle. And every 10 years, they're adding the population of the United States to this area in Southeast Asia. Here you see also human population increase. Again, in Southeast Asia, human population will increase by 41%. Africa will explode 49%. South America 7%, North America 4%. Europe will shrink slightly. Demand for eggs, meat, milk is growing, particularly in the developing world. We're anticipating that by the year 2050, the demand for animal protein will increase by 70%. That's largely a function of disposable income. The more money people make on the x-axis, the more meat they consume on the y-axis. The same is true for milk. The more people make, the more likely they are to change their dietary patterns more to an animal-based diet. As you can see, currently, we are up here on top. European countries are following, China all the way to the left. Make no mistake, in 10 years, China will be at least where the US is today. I've been there for at least 24 times. And what I have witnessed happening in China is just amazing. I was there 3 days ago. And what I see them eating today is totally different from what I saw them eating when I first visited 20 years ago. This is where global livestock is at home. And you can see there's some red in the United States. If you think we have a lot of livestock here, think again. We are nothing compared to countries like India or China. That's where by far the most livestock resides. This slide here shows where we have cropland to feed however many people we have in the world. Whether it's 3, 7, 9, or 12 billion people in the world, that's the only land we have to grow crops. Now I show you a simplified depiction of what I'm talking about. And I hope you remember this one. This here is a normal sheet of paper. Imagine this sheet of paper being the surface of the Earth. That's the entire surface of the Earth. Now I will fold this piece of paper twice until it's only 1/4 its original size. This now is the total amount of land in the world. The rest is water and ice. That's how much land we have in the world. And now I take my business card, because the equivalent amount of land of my business card is the total amount of agricultural land. The rest is forests and cities and so on. So that's the total land. This is the total agricultural land to feed however many people we have in the world. So now I take my business card and I fold it again into one piece that's 2/3 the size of my business card, and another piece that's 1/3 the size of my business card. The piece that's 2/3 of my business card is referred to as, and please remember that, it is referred to as marginal land. Marginal land is called marginal because either the soil quality doesn't allow you to grow crops or it doesn't have enough water. You cannot grow row crops and so on 2/3 of all agricultural land. How can you use that land? You can only use it with ruminant livestock because they can convert cellulose to high-value protein. There's no other use for 70% of all agricultural land than use with livestock. You cannot convert that land into cropland, like many of your special friends want the public to believe. The remaining 1/3 of my business card is the total amount of agricultural land that's referred to as arable land. That's the land where you can grow anything you want. Okay? What I find also very interesting is that many people who are, for example, vegans say, we should get rid of animal agriculture altogether. I have about 10% vegans in my class at UC Davis, and that's pretty typical for this age group across the United States, 10%. I asked, how many of you are vegans? They raised their hands. I asked them, so when you go shopping, what do you make your food buying decisions based on? They say, well, it has to be organic, and it has to be local, and blah, blah, blah. I say, okay, that's interesting. So you are a vegan and you only buy organic crops? Yes. So, well, when your organic crops are grown, they need fertilizer, right? Of course I know that. And you know that they cannot be fertilized with chemical fertilizers, also referred to as synthetic fertilizers. Yes, I know that too. So do you know how they're being fertilized, those organic crops you eat? No? So they are fertilized by something that comes out of somebody's back end. So thank a livestock producer for producing the nutrients that are needed to fertilize the food you eat. Without animal agriculture, you could not eat what you are eating. And the whole world comes crashing down to these people. It's really important to bring it home, because agriculture is an interconnected, symbiotic system, okay? The one cannot live without the other. It's that simple. This slide here is a very important one. It shows on the x-axis the total amount of milk produced per cow per year. And on the y-axis, it shows the carbon footprint per unit of fat protein corrected milk. So again, milk production on the x-axis and carbon footprint on the y-axis. What this slide shows is that a cow that produces very little milk has a very high carbon footprint because she satisfies her metabolic needs, her maintenance requirements, but there's little nutrient left to produce milk. The more milk you produce, the relatively lower is your carbon footprint. This slide was given to me by the FAO, and the person who gave it to me, I talked to him about this, and I said, so what does each data point here represent? And he said, each data point here represents a country. We have 200 countries in the world approximately, and each data point is one country. I said, so what would these countries be? And he said, well, African countries, India is someplace here. They produce about 1,000 pounds of milk in India per year. 1,000 pounds. They have hundreds of millions of cattle in India, of dairy cows in India. 1,000 pounds. We produce how much here? About, 25,000 pounds? So I asked him, so where on this slide is the United States? And he said, you are not on this slide. So why not? Because you are so good. And if we were to put you on the slide, the whole scale here would be distorted. Because we are so good, we produce so much milk per cow per year, that our relative contributions of greenhouse gases is really small, the smallest in the world. Not the highest in the world, the smallest in the world. You think the population out there in San Francisco, Sacramento, Los Angeles understands that? They definitely don't understand that, but that's the way it is. Production efficiencies and emission intensities, I know that's a mouthful, but production intensities and emission intensities are inversely related. When the one goes up, the other one goes down. That's what this slide shows. So here you see an average California cow producing about 23,000 pounds, and you see 5 of her peers in Mexico producing the same amount of milk, but way more methane and other gases. So one cow here produces the same amount of milk as 5 cows in Mexico, as 20 cows in India, but it has a profoundly different environmental footprint. This slide also from the FAO in Rome, comparing the carbon footprint on the y-axis to different regions throughout the world. As you can see, North America has the lowest, not the highest, the lowest carbon footprint. And if the US were separated from Mexico on this slide, then we would have half the column that we have on this slide. Again, we don't have the highest, we have the lowest carbon footprint of any place in the world. Why? How did we get there? A combination of 4 factors. We have improved reproductive efficiency. We have improved the veterinary system, preventing disease and treating disease. We have improved genetics of plants and animals. And we have learned to feed more energy-dense diets. These 4 factors, by and large, have allowed us to shrink the number of animals to historical numbers. We have never had fewer livestock than we have today. For example, in 1950, we used to have 25 million dairy cows in the United States. 25. Today, we have 9 million dairy cows. So way fewer cows. But with a much smaller herd, we produce 60% more milk. And the carbon footprint of this herd that we have today is 2/3 smaller than what it was in 1950. Why does not everybody consuming milk know that? Why don't you go out to the public, make sure they understand? And why do you show a 1950, 1960 Red Barn dairy on every creamery truck? That's not where we want to go back to. That's where we used to be. And we don't want to go back there. Show what you do today, because you have nothing to be ashamed of. You have a lot to be proud of. Show it. And don't show what we used to do 70 years ago. It might be the romanticized way of doing it, but I don't think it behooves you. Just a really quick depiction of what happens in other countries. As I said last week, I was in China. Half of the world's pigs live in China. Half. They are producing 1 billion pigs per year. 1 billion pigs per year. But what's more staggering than the fact that they're producing half of the world's pigs, 1 billion a year, is that they have a pre-weaning mortality of 400 million. They lose 40% of their pig crop a year pre-weaning. And ladies and gentlemen, that's China. China is highly developed. India is much worse. And Africa is a disaster. And any agency that uses global averages, like the FAO used to, will give us a black eye, because we don't want global averages to be used to depict what we do here. Because we are the leader of the gang. We don't want to be washed down to an average. You need to be regulated and you need to be assessed by what you do and not what the global average does. So in summary, livestock in developing countries, in the third world and emerging countries, makes up 70 to 80% of the carbon footprint of livestock. So they have by far the greatest contribution to livestock's carbon footprint in the world. There are reductions possible both for enteric emissions, and we have studied a lot of that at UC Davis and other places, and for manure. Production intensity and emission intensity are inversely related. I know that is, as I said, a mouthful, but it is so important. If you are highly efficient, then you have relatively low emissions. We know that intuitively from driving our cars. A car that's more fuel efficient than another will burn less gasoline, produce less emissions. The same is true for our cows. Now, there are some people who say, we need to go meatless Monday. We need to stop drinking milk and drink alternatives. There are some people who say what we eat and drink here in this country will have a profound impact on carbon emissions globally. Now let me bring that home to you. This year is what the IPCC says are the total emissions globally for greenhouse gases, about 49 gigatons of greenhouse gases in the world. Of the 49 gigatons, the total pie, 12% stem from the United States, 12%. The blue area is the contribution of the United States from fossil fuels, And these two little pie, pieces here of the pie are our food supply chain. In blue, you see plant-related carbon emissions, and in pink, you see the total contribution of our animal protein to global emissions. So all these people who tell the public that we need to drastically change what we eat or else the world will go to hell in a handbasket need to take a look at the real numbers. I'm not saying we're not dealing with a big issue. We are. But we have to put it into perspective. And many people intentionally don't put it into perspective. Really quickly, just a few photos to show you that we're not just sitting on our hands and twiddling our thumbs. A couple of things that were, in many cases, supported by the dairy industry. National Air Emission Monitoring Study where we measured emissions from conventional dairies. We did studies, large studies, measuring pollutants that are inhaled by people, by workers working on farms. We have published all these data. There are a couple dozen publications out on not just how much is emitted on dairies, but also how it affects human health. We have measured silage emissions, for example, waste emissions. We have built facilities on campus that are unique in the world, that allow you to group house animals and measure emissions from enteric sources, from manure, from feed, and so on. We have assisted in the development of process-based modelings. Think of TurboTax. This is like a turbo cow, okay? You put in different variables and it will predict the emissions that your dairy will generate. Very important predictive models. We are currently doing enteric emission research where cows are fed individual diets and then their enteric emissions, meaning those from the front end, are captured by putting them into these head chambers, so we can very precisely determine what kind of feed additive will have what kind of emission-reducing effects. Last but not least, funded by Dairy Cares, by the California Department of Food and Ag, and by the California Air Resources Board, we are doing research on pre-AMP emissions, meaning emissions before alternative manure management practices are installed on dairies. And then later, a year from now, we will go back to the same dairies after these technologies have been installed, and we measure again. And we are not just doing this alone. The Air Resources Board is doing this side by side with us. We have enjoyed a very good partnership with these agencies and with the dairy industry to help us benchmark where we are currently, because this new law, this methane law, says that you need to reduce your methane by 40% by the year 2030, below 2013 baselines. The problem is nobody measured that in 2013. We don't know what it was. So you're basically not clear as to where you are currently, and if you don't know where you're currently, how do you know how much you need to reduce by? So that's why that research is very important. So last but not least, we have worked a lot. This is CDQAP. I saw Mike Payne, Deanne Meyer have taken leadership roles in this. I was involved in working with the dairy industry, getting the word out on the air modules. I have seen this industry here come together, working on environmental issues over the years I've been here. And I can tell you that I have no doubt that this agency will do what is needed to live up to the rules that are out there and to do its share. I have the highest regards for what you're capable of, and I have also been very encouraged that I see that agencies that you're dealing with are now dealing much more with a science-based approach that is not heavy-handed, but that is working in partnership with you. So I think the membership of this room is a testament to that, because you find a lot of regulators here, you find legislators here, you find a lot of dairymen here, you find supporting industry. That's what we need to get challenges like that resolved. And I have no doubt that we can. So with that, I thank you very much for your attention. I know there will be time this afternoon. I'll be on a panel for questions. So thank you very much for having me. It's been a privilege. Thank you very much.